Mount Davidson is located in a sort of no man's land at the headwaters of Cypress Creek on the border of the Ghost River Wilderness Area and Getty Wildland Provincial Park. Access is through the Ghost Public Land Use Zone. Prior to 1988, there were no ascents. Since then, there haven't been more than a handful more. Davidson has been on my list for a decade now. Eric and I made a valiant attempt in 2017 in winter conditions but came up short and ascended the unofficial Cypress Peak instead. Since then, my friend Cornelius Rott published an ascent in 2020, and the peak has become much more popular, still only seeing a half dozen ascents or so. It was finally my turn to try again, this time with Wheatsa and hopefully more summer-like conditions. We biked the first 10 kilometers of the rough Cypress Creek road that some folks are comfortable driving and even pulling campers along, before arriving at the end of the marginally drivable access. The next 5 kilometers were true backcountry biking, with berms, at least 6 fast-flowing creek crossings, and overgrown OHV trails and cut lines. After a 2-hour bike approach, we finally started walking. After passing a final camp area along the river flats, we followed a rough trail up climbers left of a series of scenic falls and a narrowing canyon. We continued along an old trail, following the odd blaze, cut tree, and even rock cairn just below tree line south of and high above the creek. Eventually, we lost this trail. On return, we avoided bushwhacking by staying above tree line from this point. 4 hours into our day, we finally started hiking up a northwest branch of Upper Cypress Creek, south of our objective. We followed a fairly easy line up south and then southeast slopes to the lofty summit, arriving at the top 6 hours from the parking lot. Wheatsa picked me up at the early hour of 5:30, and by 7:11 we were starting our Gaia GPS recordings and pedaling up the series of backcountry roads and OHV tracks into the Front Range Rockies. Let me preface any of the biking commentary with a quick note about driving much further than we did. Depending on your vehicle and your appetite for rough roads, it is possible to drive another 9 to 10 kilometers of the approach that we, and pretty much everyone else I know, have biked. There is a good argument to be made that any time saved by driving would be less than you'd expect due to the rough conditions, but it would certainly save you a lot of physical effort. We saw Dodge vans and campers pulled much further down these roads than we expected. It was quite busy actually, with campers and vehicles parked all the way along the series of rough tracks and deeply pocketed rubble roads that we biked over the next hour. The last few kilometers were much less occupied with campers, but there was one stubborn Toyota 4Runner parked right at the end of the road, where our first crossing of Cypress Creek awaited. We were nervous enough about water levels in Cypress Creek that we packed our golf clubs along just in case we couldn't even make the first crossing.
There's some current.
Immediately after the crossing, the road was destroyed by an impressive amount of deep holes and berms. Interestingly enough, ATVs can and obviously still do drive around all the mess. At first we wondered if it was worth lugging the bikes over all that mess, but soon enough we were riding again and grateful for our stubborn Dutch genes.
Gilbert.
Wheatsa and I have a saying about bike approaches. It goes something like this: bike as far as possible and then keep biking until someone is crying. So far it's worked out pretty well, so neither of us saw any reason to change our technique on this particular day.
It's the North Creek coming into Cypress. Sunrise Wall. And there's Davidson. Long way to go yet. We're going to cross on the bikes and hope to bike another couple K.
The next hour or so was typical Front Range Rockies pedaling. A delightful mix of wading fast water, pushing uphill, getting stuck on rubble flats, and riding decent cut-line trails. As we approached the spectacular gap between Sunrise Wall and Pinto Wall, we wondered how much further the riding would last.
Beautiful morning.
We almost stopped biking after the shallow crossing through the gap. The trail continued ahead, but it rose very steeply and was quite rough underfoot. But nobody was crying yet, so we reluctantly pushed up the hill and rode down the other side to the last bike crossing of Wipers Creek.
Another crossing. Wow.
After riding one last short cut line, we found ourselves high above a confluence of Wipers Creek and two other lively bodies of water. Clearly we could ride down the track, which continued up the valley below, but I thought I heard someone quietly sobbing nearby. Then I realized it was me. The sun was now cooking hot, and the creek crossing felt good on the feet before continuing upstream on a still obvious track.
Nice.
We passed through a campsite along the creek and the marked boundary of Getty Wildland Park, and what seemed like the end of an old OHV track and any hope of being bikeable. A small trail snaked upward from the wildland border as the creek thundered through a narrow canyon to our right. To our great surprise, the trail became a very rideable road along a cut line again, hence my advice to ride a wee bit further if you've made it as far as we did anyway. The wide cut line track ended unceremoniously in a small clearing, and we continued on a much smaller, ill-defined single track into forested slopes. Wildflowers rose through thick moss carpeting the forest floor around us. A cool breeze worked as natural air conditioning as we took in the sights and sounds of this wild place. Many people have come through here over the years, but there was only the two of us on this particular day. Many folks might not understand, but the feeling of putting in a challenging approach and ending up in these wild places is hard to replicate in other experiences. If you think about it, there are very few places on the planet that you can travel for a 12-hour day within a 1-hour drive of a city of 1.5 million people and see hardly another soul.
You know what's funny? That tree is cut with a saw right behind us. It's an old cut, but it was definitely a cut. I would think the further we can follow it, the better.
After reading other trip reports, we were expecting the faint trail we were on to end. It didn't. The one thing that worried us was that it kept rising off the valley floor south of the creek. The trail was very obviously human contributed, with some clear blazes and cut trees along the way. Small stone cairns guided us across several rocky side drainages. But don't get me wrong, this was a very old, quite overgrown, and very faint trail. Don't go up here expecting any kind of highway. At a large drainage with a small waterfall and some low cliffs high above, we finally lost the trail for good. A moderate bushwhack ensued until treeline descended to meet us.
Excellent.
While the tree line descended to meet our line, the creek ascended to meet it. We walked off the south side of the creek at the perfect place to transition to its north side, south of Mount Davidson, at precisely the ideal place. Talk about perfect. We agreed that we'd stick to the south side at tree line to the aforementioned side drainage on return. From the creek crossing, the route became pretty obvious and straightforward. We were now over 4 hours into our day and starting up a 1,000-meter final grind to the top of our objective. At least it was a workout with beautiful views. As we ascended a northwest branch of Upper Wipers Creek, we took in the soaring cliffs and alpine meadows forming the headwater valley as it stretched out below. We followed the valley as it curved under south rubble and slab cliffs and picked a line ever upward.
Huh.
Despite appearances, everything stayed on the easy side of scrambling. We looked for slabs and solid footing on the ascent, making our way to the southeast ridge with spectacular views back through the Pinto Sunrise Gap towards a diminutive Black Rock Mountain and Sheep Meadow Mountain. The upper slopes were still covered in their winter coat, and we took turns kicking slushy and very cold steps until finally popping out at the summit 6 hours from the parking lot.
No, we're good. Yeah.
Views were naturally sublime from the nearly 3,000 meter summit, and we spent time taking it all in. A cairn just off to the north had us traversing snow to see if it was higher, but it measured the same as the first summit.
Yeah, right where I was standing.
After descending the giant south slopes of Davidson, we crossed the creek again and ascended slightly at tree line, stubbornly staying high despite our leg asking WTF we were thinking. It was totally worth it. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Our secret weapon in the mountains is not worrying about losing or gaining a few hundred extra meters of elevation to find the best routes. In this case, we avoided almost 100% of the bush by first hiking along tree line and then descending to the old trail at the correct drainage.
Back on trail. see if we can mostly stick to it.
"10 hours into our day, we were back at the bikes. If we were a little nervous about water levels in Wipers Creek at 0700, we were most certainly more than a little nervous now, but there wasn't much to do but get into it. The first few crossings were actually easy peasy. The riding was decent too, much better than trudging along rocky roads with our home planet star baking overhead.
Yeah. Woo. Yeah, don't underestimate this ride. It is pretty rough in spots.
After the first few crossings, the next few were slightly more challenging, the deepest being about crotch high with a strong current. We made it.
Big time messed up the road so no one can get through, and we gotta cross somewhere here.
Somewhat strangely, the final few crossings were easier again, although we did spend more time looking for reasonable lines across the raging creek.
Thanks.
The final 10 kilometers flew by. It's always surprising how much height you gain on approach, but it was clear to us on return. A few uphill sections had us sweating pretty good, but within 1.5 hours of starting the exit ride, we were done. What a day! I highly encourage this outing for folks who don't mind backcountry biking and a sense of adventure. It doesn't get much better than this, honestly. The riding is much easier than other front range accesses such as the Cutoff Creek, Clearwater River, and the Ram River approaches. I would say this is a perfect test excursion for those other areas. If you love this, you're ready for the other even more remote rivers and headwater valleys that the Front Range Rockies have hidden from the average traveler.